Hello. Today I wanted to do something I have not done before. Not like this. I want to read you to sleep, or read to you to relax, or for whatever reason you may be here. This is a book I read 3 years ago, and it's called Without You, There's No Us. My Time with the Sons of North Korea's Elite, a memoir by 𝑺𝒐𝒂𝒏𝒆𝒍. So this just shows a map of North Korea, well, China, North Korea, Pyongyang, South Korea, DMZ, the demilitarized zone. Okay. Prologue. Time there seemed to pass differently. When you're shut off from the world, every day is exactly the same as the one before. This sameness has a way of wearing down your soul until you become nothing but a breathing, toiling, consuming thing that awakes to the sun and sleeps at the dawning of the dark. The emptiness runs deep, deeper with each slowing day, and you become increasingly invisible and inconsequential. That's how I felt at times, a tiny insect circling itself, only to continue and continue. There in that relentless vacuum, nothing moved. No news came in or out. No phone calls to or from anyone. No emails, no letters. No ideas not prescribed by the regime. 30 missionaries disguised as teachers and 270 male North Korean students, and me, the sole writer disguised as a missionary, disguised as a teacher. Locked in that prison disguised as a campus in an empty Pyongyang suburb, heavily guarded around the clock, all we had was one another. Part 1. Anti-Atlantis. At 12:45 p.m. on Monday, December 19th, 2011, there was a knock at my door. My heart sank. I knew who would be there. I ignored it and continued shoving my clothes into the suitcase. The knock came again. She knew that I was inside, and she was not going to go away. Finally, I stopped what I was doing and opened the door. There stood Martha, a lanky 24-year-old British girl with glasses, with whom I had been sharing teaching duties. "You must come to the meeting right now," she said. I sighed, feeling the weight of the past 6 months there among 30 Christian missionaries, now gathered in secret for the pre-Christmas prayer meeting. Then she whispered, "He's dead," pointing at the ceiling. I thought that she meant God, and I was momentarily confused. I have never read the Bible, and my family is largely atheist. Then she said, "Him." And I realized that she meant the main god in this world, Kim Jong-il. Was it fate that my North Korean experience began with his birthday and ended with his death? It was February 2002 when I first glimpsed the forbidden city of Pyongyang as part of a Korean American delegation visiting for Kim Jong-il's 60th birthday celebrations. It was only a few months after 9/11, and George W. Bush had just christened that country part of an axis of evil, so it was an inauspicious time for a single American woman to cross its border with a group of strangers. Over the next 9 years, with each implausible crossing of its immutable border, I became further intoxicated by this unknown and unknowable place. This isolated nation existed under an entirely different system from the rest of the world. So different that when I arrived in 2011, I found myself in ch1. Okay, so I'm gonna mispronounce stuff in this book. Korean and English and Chinese all alike. But just deal with it, okay? We're just gonna deal with it. I found myself in ch1, year 100. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, follows a different calendar system, which counts time from the birth of their original great leader, Kim Il-sung, who died in 1994. ch1, which roughly means self-reliance, is at the core of North Korea's foundational philosophy. Almost every book I ever saw there was written by or about the great leader. The state-run media, including the newspaper Rodong Sinmun and Chosun Central TV, reported almost exclusively on the great leader. Almost every film, every song, every monument heralded the miraculous achievements of the great leader. The role passed down through 3 generations, from Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un, who was 29 when he assumed power in 2012 and became the world's youngest head of state. It has been reported that every home in the country is fitted with a speaker through which government propaganda can be broadcast, and that more than 35,000 statues of the great leaders are scattered across the country. But while the regime dabbles with nuclear weapons, provoking repeated United Nations sanctions, the people of North Korea suffer. The 1990s famine, known as the Arduous March, killed millions, as much as 1/10 of the entire population, and even now the World Food Program reports that 80% of North Koreans experience food shortages and hunger. It is estimated that forced labor, executions, and concentration camps have claimed over 1 million lives since 1948. According to the latest UN report, the DPRK maintains some 20 gulags holding some 120,000 political prisoners. Human Rights Watch estimates 200,000. These numbers are inevitably approximate since nothing there is verifiable. Almost no North Koreans are allowed out. Defectors risk execution, and almost no foreigners are allowed in, except those on packaged tours, most holding European passports, and they get to see only what is allowed. In this global age of information, where secrets have become an anachronism, North Korea stands apart. My obsession with this troubling country, because it indeed became an obsession, was based on more than just journalistic interest. The first time I entered North Korea, I was not sure what a delegate was, and I did not know much at all about the pro-Kim Jong-il group I was traveling with. This makes me sound either extremely irreverent or extremely young, but I was neither. My ignorance was willful. Since getting a visa into the country was so difficult, I thought it was best not to appear too inquisitive. But there was something else too. A part of me, a very insistent voice inside, did not want to know those details. For those of us who grew up in the 1970s South Korea, anything to do with North Korea is accompanied by a certain foreboding. And for those of us whose family members were abducted into North Korea, this fear runs still deeper. If I had known as much as I do now, more than a decade later, I doubt I would have made that first fateful trip. But I did get on a flight from JFK on Korean Air, one of the world's most modern and luxurious airlines, and then almost 20 hours later, via Seoul and then Beijing, boarded North Korea's state-owned Air Koryo, where the only reading material was a magazine about the great leader. And I would cross that same border into Pyongyang repeatedly for the next 9 years. Every story has its origin in a time that came before. My obsession had its roots in the year 1945, decades before I was even born. It was then, when the 5,000-year-old kingdom of Korea was divided by the Allies who liberated it from Japan, that everything went wrong. And since then, everything has continued to be wrong, and nothing, not even the 3-year-long war that began in 1950, has made much difference. Or maybe my obsession became inevitable when I was a child growing up in South Korea. The years I lived there remain unnervingly still, pristinely intact in my mind. As I get older, the memory of those years grows bigger, each nook casting a longer shadow. Such is the condition of a first-generation immigrant for whom everything is separated into now and then, into before the move and after. The ocean that separates the adoptive home and the old country also divides time. I was just 13 when we came to America. The early 80s in South Korea was a time of political unrest and economic upheaval, and my father's businesses, from the shipping company and the mining ventures to the hotels, collapsed rapidly. Bankruptcy in South Korea was punishable by a hefty jail term, and we fled our home in the dead of night. Like many new immigrants to America, my family was now poor and kept moving from Queens to Jersey City to the Bronx to Fort Lee. I grasped few of the vast changes that seemed to have occurred overnight in my physical surroundings. I knew that I was no longer in Korea, and yet it was beyond my comprehension that this loss of home was permanent. Another foreign concept that took time to absorb was that I was now Asian, a term that I had heard mentioned only in a social studies class. Back home, yellow was the color of the forsythia that bloomed every spring along the fence that separated our estate from the houses down the hill. I certainly never thought of my skin as being the same shade. Those years were also marked by silence. My mother tongue was suddenly gone, replaced by unfamiliar sounds called English. It seemed a miracle when I took the SAT and made it to college. After graduation, I spent a couple of years in London, searching for something I could never quite name, then returned to New York City to a series of part-time jobs and a rent-stabilized apartment in the East Village, where I spent my 20s. But I never felt at home there either, and kept subletting my apartment and taking off, often on meager writing fellowships that required me to live in some remote place, whether it be a 100-year-old cabin in New Hampshire or an empty room facing a desert hill in Wyoming. There were no cell phones then, and I was always calling my parents collect. I remember getting off of a Greyhound one afternoon and standing in a phone booth outside a coffee shop in Taos, New Mexico, and my father on the line from New Jersey ending the call with, "If you keep moving like this, one day you'll be too far away to come back." During those itinerant years, I found myself on the Ligurian coast of Italy, which sounded better than it felt. It was a place whose awe-inspiring beauty so oddly failed to touch me, that for years afterward I would look for an opportunity to drop the word Liguria in conversations, such as, "I wore this dress often that autumn I was living in Liguria," or "I never finished that novel I was working on in Liguria," as if to remind myself that I had spent nearly 2 months there. Some experiences are like that. You live through them, and yet you aren't quite there. Korea was the opposite. My first 13 years remained real for me like nothing since. When you lose your home at a young age, you spend your life looking for its replacement. Over the years, I have never considered any apartment more than temporary. Each one remains spare, with bare walls and no personal touches, as though I might need to grab everything in a few seconds and run. People often ask me where my things are. The question always brings me back to South Korea. In my mind, I finally return. I put down my suitcase at the base of the incredibly long flight of steps I have never forgotten, and look up at my childhood home towering above. Strangely, in 2002, when I visited Pyongyang for the first time, I felt more at home than I had since I left Seoul as a child. There was a sense of recognition. The past was all right there before me. Generations of Koreans separated by division, decades of longing, loss, hurt, regret, guilt. I identified with it in a way that I could never shake off. I thought that if only I could understand the place, then I could find a way to help put the fragments back together. Like most Koreans, whether the North or the South, I dreamed, perhaps irrationally, of reunification. I returned repeatedly until 2011. I am often asked, which Korea do you come from, north or south? It is a nonsensical question. The chance of me or any Korean out and about in the world being from north is almost nil. Virtually no one gets out of North Korea. It is a locked nation, locked away from South Korea, from the rest of the world, from those of us whose families got trapped there. It is the sort of a lock for which there is no open sesame, and the world seems to have forgotten why it was sealed up tight to begin with, and who threw away the key. My Korea is the South, the industrial, overachieving, better half that spewed out Hyundai and Samsung, and in the 6 decades since the bloody war has established itself as the 15th richest country in the world. But the South is never just the South. Its very existence conjures up the unmentionable North, which, with its habitual nuclear threats and the antics of its bizarre dictator, casts a shadow far beyond its own peninsula. In recent years, North Korea has steadily become a siren for the hankering mind, making outsiders wait and guess, and then wait some more indefinitely. Both my parents hail from families separated by the partition, and it is really the unrequited heartbreak of those separations, a heartbreak that lasts generations, that brought me north. If this were the sort of story that invites readers to nod with empathy and walk away both satisfied and educated, I would say that I traveled full circle. But in truth, my journey was barely half a circle, a sad one that could never be completed, because those who are at the center of the harrowing history are almost certainly long dead or old and dying, and time is running out before their stories are lost in the dust of the past. The Korean War lasted 3 years, with millions either dead or separated. It never really ended, but instead paused in the 1953 armistice exactly where it began, with Koreas on both sides of the 38th parallel. Historians often refer to it as the Forgotten War, but no Korean considers it forgotten. Theirs is not a culture of forgetting. The war is everywhere in today's Koreas. There is, for example, the story of my father's young female cousins, nursing students aged 17 and 18, who disappeared during the war. Decades later, in the 1970s, their mother, my father's aunt, received a letter from North Korea via Japan, the only contact her daughters ever made with her, and from that moment on, she was summoned to the Korean Central Intelligence Agency every few months on suspicion of espionage, until she finally left South Korea for good and died in San Antonio, Texas. The girls were never heard from again. And there was my uncle, my mother's brother, who was just 17 when he was abducted by North Korean soldiers at the start of the war in June 1950. He was never seen again. He might or might not have been taken to Pyongyang, and it was this suspended state of not knowing that drove my mother's mother nearly crazy, and my mother, and to some degree me, who inherited their sorrow. Stories such as these abound in South Korea, and probably North Korea, if its people were allowed to tell them. Separation haunts the affected long after the actual incident. It is a perpetual act of violation. You know that the missing are there, just a few hours away, but you cannot see them, or write to them, or call them. It could be your mother trapped on the other side of the border. It could be your lover whom you will long for the rest of your life. It could be your child, whom you cannot get to, although he calls out your name and cries himself to sleep every night. From Seoul, Pyongyang looms like a shadow, about 120 miles away, so close but impossible to touch. Decades of such longing sicken a nation. The loss is remembered and remembered like an illness, a heartbreak from which there is no healing, and you are left to wonder what happened to the life you were supposed to have together. For those of us raised by mothers and fathers who experienced such trauma firsthand, it is impossible not to continue this remembering. I first became aware of the Pyongyang University of Science and Technology by chance. In February 2008, I was assigned by Harper's Magazine to follow the New York Philharmonic to Pyongyang, where they were to perform in concert. About 100 foreign correspondents rushed to be part of it. Not being a real journalist, at least I did not consider myself one, I dreaded the prospect of covering the DPRK alongside so many veterans, until I realized how little they knew of North Korea and how little they managed to find out. A cable news anchor hosted a special in which she watched the concert on TV with an average North Korean family that had been selected by the government. She then asked random North Koreans, also selected by the regime, questions such as, "Do you think America is your sworn enemy?" and taught one interviewee the word friend, which the woman dutifully repeated. As a prelude to the media extravaganza in Pyongyang, I attended a party in Beijing. Though Pyongyang is only a couple of hours' drive from Seoul, you have to go through China to enter it. The party was held at the U.S. Embassy in honor of the Philharmonic's patrons. They were a colorful bunch, ranging from the founder of Compaq Computers to a PR guru for the NFL to a Japanese countess from Venice, Italy. The women were dressed in furs. 25 of them had donated $50,000 each for the novelty of such a trip, and they were visibly excited. One of them told me giddily that she had never even been to South Korea, but here she was, going to the north. Another told me that he really enjoyed going to backward places, and there were no more backward places left except for North Korea. A few others urged that I must, absolutely must, meet a certain Mrs. Gund, who turned out to be a Korean-Brazilian woman around my age, whose husband had at one time appeared on the Forbes list of the wealthiest men in the world. It was Mrs. Gund who mentioned that an international university was being set up in Pyongyang, and that the faculty would all be foreigners. It seemed improbable, but when you follow North Korea, you become used to unlikely scenarios. I asked for more information, and she shrugged and told me to email a certain President Kim, the head of the entire operation. President Kim turned out to be James Kim, an evangelical Christian Korean American, and a quick internet search brought up interviews with him about a similar college he had set up in the early 1990s in Yanji, China, called Yanbian University of Science and Technology. In one of the interviews, Kim said that he had raised $10 million from evangelical churches worldwide to construct the school in Pyongyang. When asked whether any of the money had made its way to the DPRK's regime, he claimed to have brought all the building materials and equipment in from China. Running the school would be quite expensive, with heating costs alone estimated to be at least $1,500 per day. In response to a question about who would fund its operations, he demurred and referred to the Bank of Heaven. Although the school was still under construction, I immediately submitted an application to teach there, and for the next couple of years, I exchanged emails about it with various people in China, South Korea, and the United States. I knew little except that they were spokespeople for President Kim, who, according to my principal contact, Joan, was very busy traveling. Joan, who was based at the YUST campus, wrote long, digressive emails about the Yanji flowers blooming in the spring and the busy schedule she was keeping in the grace of the Lord overseeing the project. For the first year of our correspondence, the project seemed vague at best. Once I was contacted by a Korean-American librarian from a university in Illinois who invited me to a fundraising event for PUST at a church in Evanston. About 50 or so Asian students, mostly Korean-American or Korean, were there, and for about an hour they prayed and cried. Strange as it was, the event seemed to legitimize the existence of the school. Finally, in December 2009, a call came from President Kim's Seoul office telling me to get ready to go to Pyongyang in a few months. No one ever questioned me about my faith, and I did not volunteer any information. I received almost no instructions. What should I bring? How would I be able to keep in touch with those at home? Such questions went unanswered. Then came the boat incident. On March 26, 2010, the South Korean Navy ship ch1 sank off the country's west coast, and 46 sailors died. An international investigation revealed that the ship had been blown up by a North Korean submarine torpedo. Inter-Korean relations chilled, and the door that seemed to have opened a crack shut. I doubted that the school would be operating anytime soon, or that anyone would be able to get a visa. The project was on pause again. At the end of that year, however, PUST finally opened. Somehow my application had been lost, they said, and they assembled the teaching staff for the first semester from those at their YUST branch. Be ready to come in the spring, Joan wrote. Then silence again until April 2011, when an email with the subject line "purchase list" appeared in my inbox. My visa, once approved for entry, had to be stamped by as many as 35 government agencies within North Korea to be approved for release. President Kim had asked that the process be expedited or waived altogether for the PUST teachers, and they were waiting for a new law to pass for this to happen. A new law? That could take months, even years, I said via Skype. But Joan assured me that in North Korea such a thing could happen in a matter of days, and told me to start packing. Joan said that I would need a refrigerator, as well as toilet paper and butter. Was there no way of getting those things there? I wondered. You bring everything to Pyongyang, I was told. I wired money to Joan so that she could purchase a refrigerator and have it shipped from China, but I was not sure whether a block of frozen butter would survive the long-haul flights from New York to Pyongyang. There were so many things, it turned out, that I could not do without. You would think that being a writer, I would have put books at the top of my list, but in fact, books were the last thing on my mind. The things I packed were more basic: an extra pair of glasses, disposable contact lenses, sanitary napkins, ibuprofen, vitamins and antibiotics of all kinds, plus as many protein bars as I could jam in my suitcases. Visas to North Korea are almost always issued on the eve of the visitor's entry date, and plane tickets from Beijing to Pyongyang can only be purchased with a visa in hand. This meant that I had to leave for Asia immediately and be on call, which is how I found myself stuck in Seoul for the next 7 weeks waiting for my visa, which had been blocked at the last minute. The wait came with no excuse or explanation. In any negotiation, North Korea has absolute power regarding who does what and at what price, because there is always a price. That summer, monsoon came early. In that part of Asia, rain begins one day and does not stop for a month straight. This usually happens in July, but it had begun by mid-June that year, and I was miserable. I had already been waiting more than a month for North Korea to approve my visa when the rain began. I would be awoken at dawn by the pelting sound against the window pane, my hair soaked from the humidity. Despite air conditioning, I was perpetually sweaty and sluggish, which only added to my feelings of helplessness. The year had started badly and was turning worse. I had recently been through a horrible breakup that came on the heels of 9 blighting years. Seoul was not easy either. My sister, who had always been my emotional rock, had moved back there from New York. She was not well, and my morning ritual consisted of cutting up organic Asian pears and melons for her after soaking them in organic vegetable wash. We were worried about bacteria because of her immune system was compromised, and this state of worry was jarring to me since I was the perennial younger sister and I had never taken care of her before. In the afternoon, I would accompany her to doctors for checkups, blood tests, or physical therapy, or I would take her 2 girls, aged 7 and 11, to band practice and to get their chickenpox shots, the things that moms in all parts of the world do. Although I did not fit in among the South Korean moms and was always reminded of the fact that I had never become a mother myself. I should have been keeping tabs on the breaking news about North Korea, which inevitably concerned their heir apparent Kim Jong-un, whom the foreign media referred to as either precious leader or supreme leader. But instead, I took solace in writing emails to an old lover in Brooklyn, with whom I had just reconnected. I knew that I was not ready for another relationship, but I wanted to love him that summer. Nothing distracts a wounded soul during trying circumstances like a new love, even the recycled kind. And every night as I willed myself to sleep in that thick, heavy Seoul monsoon, I would remind myself that I had this lover back home, and all I had to do was finish the trip safely so I could get back to him. He did not love me and was perpetually busy, so he wasn't good about answering my needlessly beseeching emails, but he did respond when he felt like it. That summer in the flooded city of Seoul, his emails were like glimpses of the sun. Waiting for news on my visa, I often thought about those who had gone missing, my mother's brother and my father's cousins, how their mothers must have waited and waited, not moving houses after the war for as long as possible so that their sons and daughters could be sure of finding their way back home. Every day, the mothers must have hoped that this would be the day. They must have looked up expectantly each time a doorbell rang. Perhaps that is my child. Please let it be my child. Yes, it has to be. Because it is nonsensical, the idea that you would never see your baby again. Because in our world, nothing is ever lost without a trace. That summer was also about many other kinds of waiting. I waited for the day when I would stop hurting over my failed engagement. I waited for the man in Brooklyn to email me back with some sign of affection, because at that point in my life, I was especially susceptible to kindness. Most of all, I waited for my sister's treatments to be over so that she wouldn't be in pain. In the midst of all of this, I waited to hear about the visa to North Korea, which I believed in the depths of my heart was my way out of whatever I was feeling. Then, in late June, a phone call came. My visa had been cleared, and I would be teaching in the summer semester. The orientation would take place in Beijing in 3 days' time, and by the 1st of July, we would leave for North Korea. And that was the prologue and chapter 1. The book is incredibly fascinating. And although that was pretty long to read out loud, I hope that there is enough interest in this for me to maybe make a video for a chapter 2. I feel like it's one of those books that never leaves you. I have a soft spot for memoirs. And this one was just it just stood so far apart from so many others that I've read. So hopefully anybody who makes it to the end of this video has some interest in what happens to Sookie Kim when she gets into North Korea and starts teaching English to the sons of North Korea's elite and gets close to them and learns the ins and outs of daily life in North Korea and what it's like there. So please let me know if you're interested. I probably won't make a chapter 2 if there's not a whole lot of interest, but yeah, leave a comment and we'll take it from there. Thank you.